You're standing in the temple courts, where everything echoes. Stone, steps, voices bouncing off pillars. It's crowded, tense, and loud, the kind of argument that draws a circle of listeners without anyone admitting they're listening. Jesus is there, not debating like a philosopher, but speaking like someone who owns the room. And the crowd is pushing back hard. Abraham, identity, authority. Who do you think you are? Then the sentence lands. Before Abraham was, I am. Not, I was. Not, I existed. Not even, I was there. He says it like a title. Like a name. And you can feel the air change. People stop reasoning and start reaching. Hands go down to the ground. Fingers close around stones. That's the moment John wants you to freeze. Because stoning isn't what you do when someone merely claims to be important. It's what you do when you believe someone has crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. A line drawn around God himself. So here's the tension. If, did Jesus ever claim to be God? Is just a simple yes or no. Why does one sentence sound, to them, like a death sentence? Something is happening in that sentence that most modern ears don't even hear. Hidden in plain sight. Here's what everyone gets wrong about the question: did Jesus ever claim to be God? Some people treat it like a courtroom game. If Jesus never said the exact modern formula, I am God, then the answer must be no. Others point to one line, I am, and say the case is closed, yes. But the Bible actually teaches something more textured and, honestly, more dramatic. In Jesus' world, identity wasn't usually declared with a blunt slogan. It was revealed through scripture echo, covenant language, divine prerogatives. You didn't just announce who you were, you located yourself inside Israel's sacred story in a way that faithful listeners could recognize. So when Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, the point isn't that he finally said the magic words. The point is that he deliberately reaches back into Israel's most foundational, God revelation moment, Exodus, and pulls that language into the present. That image you pictured in the temple courts? Underneath it is an argument about the divine name, the God of Abraham, and whether Jesus is speaking with the kind of authority only Israel's God can carry. John is not trying to get you to win a debate with a quote. John is inviting you to hear the resonance. To notice how Jesus uses I am language, wilderness themes, and divine identity texts like threads, then ties them around himself. So the real question isn't, did he ever say it the way a modern person would? The real question is, how does Jesus take the scriptures that define YHWH, the God who saves, the God who speaks from the fire, the God who led Israel through the wilderness, and use them to disclose who he is? And to understand why the crowd reached for stones, you have to go deeper than the English words. And once you step back into their world, the crowd's reaction stops looking irrational and starts looking inevitable. First-century Jewish faith wasn't a vague belief in a God. It was a fiercely guarded conviction that Israel's God YHWH is unique. Not one among many. The one who created, the one who redeemed, the one whose name is not shared. That's why the Shema mattered so much. Hear, O Israel. The Lord is one. In that atmosphere, blasphemy wasn't mainly about saying something rude. It was about crossing the boundary of God's exclusive identity, taking what belongs to him alone. So, claiming didn't need to sound like, hello, I am God. It could happen by assuming God's roles, God's rights, God's name, and the Gospels show people catching that. Think about John chapter 5. Jesus speaks of God as, my Father, in a way that isn't just devotional, it's unique. John tells you the result. They sought to kill him because he was making himself equal with God. Or John chapter 10, where Jesus speaks of unity with the Father, and again stones appear, and the accusation comes out loud. You, being a man, make yourself God. Notice, they didn't need him to recite a formula. They heard an identity violation. And there's another layer most readers miss. In the ancient world, Scripture was a shared memory palace. A single phrase could unlock an entire passage. When someone quoted or echoed a line, they weren't being poetic, they were inviting you to hear the whole context. That means Jesus can claim something enormous with a few loaded words, because those words carry Israel's story inside them. So the question isn't whether Jesus spoke plainly enough for modern ears. The question is whether he spoke clearly enough for a temple-trained, scripture-saturated audience. And if they reached for stones, you have to ask what scriptural boundary they thought he had just stepped over, because the line he touches runs straight through Exodus itself. That boundary becomes visible when you listen to the actual wording John preserves, not just the idea behind it. In John chapter 8 verse 58, Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." In Greek, it's *ego eimi, literally, I am. Now, ego eimi can be ordinary in conversation, like, it's me. But John puts it in a place where ordinary grammar feels almost impossible. Jesus doesn't say, "Before Abraham was, I was." He uses a present tense, I am, to speak about existence prior to Abraham. That's not just weird wording. It's deliberate, because Israel already has a famous, I am, moment. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses asks God for his name. And God answers, I am WHOIAM. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, that answer is also tied to, I am, ego eimi. The point isn't that Jesus is quoting a dictionary entry for the divine name. The point is that he is standing in the temple, in the middle of Israel's identity story, and speaking in the register of the God who spoke from the burning bush. And then John does something even more subtle. He surrounds John chapter 8 with wilderness and Exodus imagery. John chapter 6 has bread in the wilderness manna language, and Jesus says he is the bread from heaven. John chapter 7 centers on water at the feast, with Jesus crying out about living water. John chapter 8 opens with the claim, I am the light of the world, which echoes Israel's wilderness guidance, God's presence leading, revealing, protecting. So when you reach John chapter 8 verse 58, you're not hearing an isolated riddle. You're hearing a crescendo. Bread, water, light, and then the sentence that ties it to the bush, I am. This is what the Bible actually teaches. Jesus is not merely teaching about God's provision in the Exodus. He is presenting himself as the source. Those signs always pointed to the divine presence in Israel's wilderness story, now standing in front of them. And if that's what John is doing, then one, I am, line isn't the whole case. It's the doorway, because Jesus keeps applying God-only texts and God-only authority to himself, and that's where the claim becomes impossible to ignore. You've seen why the crowd heard blasphemy, and why I am rings with Exodus thunder. But John doesn't stop at one phrase. Jesus takes multiple God-only roles, one by one. Not just in wording, either. Watch what Jesus does, and notice which scriptures he steps into like they were written with his name on them. Start with the thing everyone in the Gospels treats as God's territory, forgiving sins. In the Synoptic stories, Jesus doesn't only announce that God can forgive, he speaks forgiveness over a person as an exercised authority. And the reaction is immediate. Who can forgive sins but God alone? That question is doing the same work as the stones in John chapter 8. It's a boundary marker. God's prerogative. God's right. Then there's worship. The Gospels aren't shy about people bowing before Jesus, clinging to him, honoring him in ways Israel normally guards for YHWH. Even when you keep the focus tight, the pattern is plain. Jesus receives what faithful Jews are trained to reserve. But John sharpens it even further. In John chapter 10, Jesus says, I and the Father are one, and once again stones. And when they accuse him, Jesus doesn't answer like someone who merely misspoke. He argues from Scripture, because the whole debate is about scriptural identity. The question isn't, did you say the modern sentence? The question is, are you putting yourself on God's side of the line? And then Jesus does something even more explosive in Mark 14. Under oath, at the trial, he speaks of the Son of Man, seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. That's Daniel 7 language, an enthroned figure receiving dominion in the presence of God. In Israel's imagination, riding the clouds is not common human imagery. It's the kind of picture the scriptures use for YHWH's own majestic arrival. So when Jesus places himself there beside God's throne, arriving with God's own kind of authority, the high priest hears it as blasphemy. Put it together. Forgiving, receiving worship, claiming unity, taking Daniel's throne room vision onto his own lips. The I am line isn't a lonely proof text. It's one note in a chord. And the chord sounds like Israel's God. Which means the real issue isn't whether Jesus ever claimed it in modern terms, it's whether the Gospels are asking you to recognize a divine identity revealed through a whole tapestry of God-only words and God-only rights. Because in the end, this isn't a trivia question about whether Jesus ever used the right syllables. The Gospels place him in the place only God can stand. The God who spoke from fire. The God who fed a people who couldn't feed themselves. The God who turned wilderness into a corridor of mercy. And then astonishingly that same divine presence walks into the world with a human face, and speaks with human breath, and says, I am. That means Jesus is not merely the messenger of the Exodus God. He is the Exodus God in person, still rescuing, still providing, still calling people out of slavery and into covenant life. Not by force, by revelation, by making himself known. And it means the Bible isn't two disconnected books stitched together. Exodus is not a backstory you outgrow. It's a vocabulary God uses so you can recognize him when he arrives. So when the crowd reaches for stones, you're watching more than ancient anger. You're watching the collision between the holiness of God and the shock of God drawing near. The question underneath every yes and no is quieter and heavier. If Jesus is truly bearing the divine name, what else can he be but worthy? If this kind of close reading opened the text for you, there's more to uncover, more places where the Old Testament is quietly shaping the very words of Jesus. You're invited to subscribe and keep walking through Scripture with that kind of light.